Since it is my pleasure to be the first speaker at this conference, I've chosen a theme that I think is very important for cooperation. I'm comparing only Norwegians and Russians, and our colleagues from Sweden and Finland will recognize some of the examples I shall present and will probably have more and other experiences from their connections with Russia and the Soviet Union through the years. This lecture is a byproduct of many years' studies of Russian culture, language and literature, and also of literature specifically discussing Russian and Norwegian way of behaving in different situations, and older literature telling about Russians visiting northern Norway. In connection with the work I've done on Norsk, I've browsed through a lot of travel literature from our regions, and I've seen that the Russian travelers from the 19th century were a bit skeptical to the Norwegians, and vice versa. The people who were involved in the bartering, however, and consequently knew each other better, on the whole were positive. I would also like to mention that I found some very moving statements from when the Pomor barters were called home in connection with the First World War. How the Norwegians would miss them when they would not come back. Alexander Krylov's booklet, Russia and Norway, So Close and So Far, is part of my material, including some questionnaires filled in by students at beginners courses of Russian and Norwegian in Alta and Arkhangelsk. And so are also the questionnaires that Professor Krylov and I have sent out to a number of former and today's Russian and Norwegian exchange students and researchers in connection with the book NARFU plans to edit for the anniversary of the Barents region next January. I can add that when accompanying Russian delegations in Norway and Norwegian in Russia and translating for them, one really gets to see and hear what surprises both sides. It is, of course, not difficult to find cultures that are much more different than the Russian and the Norwegian, but it can still be useful to be a bit more aware about some differences. And I would like to stress very much that the differences between us must certainly have changed over the years, not least with the establishment of the Barents region and the possibilities we have today to visit, study, and also work in the other country. When white refugees arrived in Norway after the revolution, they were met differently in different North Norwegian ports. Welcomed in Hammerfest, but not in Tromse, where the workers in the shipyards regarded the fleeing whites as traitors to the workers' revolution. The questionnaires Professor Krylov and I are collecting now show that we know each other, much better and know much more about each other than we did before. And I shall return to some of our findings shortly. I want to mention that I'm aware that the Russians find that the Norwegians speak in a very didactic tone to foreigners, thinking that we know better. The first someone told me this, I didn't quite believe that it was so. I wondered if this related only to me, and if it could partly be a result of my having been a teacher for many years. But it turned out that it was not so. Russians really find that Norwegians in general think that they know better, not only than the Russians, I'm afraid, and that we are eager to tell, or rather to teach everybody about, for instance, our fantastic system of democracy, which we think would be good for everybody in the whole world. Quite honestly, the first Norwegian documents about the Barents cooperation stressed that we should promote democracy in Russia, And I've even seen an evaluation stating that the goal had not been reached. There was still no democracy. Another thing that really surprised me was being told that Norwegians, as opposed to Russians, are very bureaucratic. Many Norwegians would say the opposite. This could partly be related to the fact that in Russia, a leader or a university rector, for instance, is the boss with capital B and can decide much more on her own than their Norwegian counterpart. Making a decision in Norway, going throughout different boards and councils, is a longer process. We could say democratic. You would say bureaucratic. On the one hand, it can be irritating and unpractical that it takes time to reach a conclusion. On the other, it's good when people feel that their voice counts and support decisions which will influence their future work. It's almost 50 years since my first visit to Leningrad in the then Soviet Union as an exchange student. As you know, at that time, no Western student would get a permission to go to Arkhangelsk. It's 20 years since my first visit to Arkhangelsk. And of course, neither Russia nor Norway is the same. We change all the time. And we become more like each other. Although I must say that if we end up with a world with no differences between the countries, that will certainly make it less interesting to go abroad and to visit. I was really thrilled to see Arkhangelsk when I came here first, especially the wooden pavements and dirt roads, the small lumber houses, and the beautiful small wooden villas. It reminded me of the great Russian literature and was in a way more Russian than the large Soviet apartment houses. My Russian hosts were partly negative to my enthusiasm, assuring me that I would not enjoy living in those houses during the bitterly cold Arkhangelsk winter. That's probably correct. However, I still think it is a pity that so many of them disappeared. Not far from the dormitory where the Western students at Leningrad State University, named after A.A. Zhdanov, lived, there was a small kolkhoz market where the peasants came to sell their produce. We found it was an exciting place and went there often to buy berries, apples, jams, household utensils, colored wooden spoons, etc. And we tried to take photos there and were thrown out. The peasants, and even more the militia men, thought we wanted to make pictures to show that the Russians were old-fashioned, underdeveloped, and did certainly not understand our liking of the picturesque. During my first visit to the then Pomor Teaching Training College in 1992, I was asked to talk to the students and tell them what it was like to be a student in Tromse. And among the things I told them was that the rectors of our universities had signed an agreement about student exchange. The Pomor students, however, laughed and assured me that if some students were to go to Tromse, it would be someone with good connections in Russian Palo Alto, and not an ordinary student like themselves. And what were they curious to know about their Norwegian counterparts? And remember that this was a time when not many foreigners visited Arkhangelsk, and few of those foreigners could speak Russian. Very few, if any, of the students had been abroad. The first question was, how did Norwegian students dress for class? What kind of student organizations did Tromse have? Did the students in Tromse have obligatory sport or gymnastics, which they did not? Did they have a weekly day of military training for the men and first aid for the women as part of their university curriculum? They did not. and how did they spend their free time? The Pomor students asked what Norwegian students would wear to class, and this was a reasonable question. To begin with, Russians dress more formally than Norwegians do. The men will often wear a suit and a tie, and they find that the Norwegians' way of dressing is very informal, and they can even feel a bit offended by our carelessness. The way one dresses in Norway does of course depend on where one works. There are some ministries, banks, lawyers' offices where people are more formal than others. And there are certain jobs where the men will wear suit and often also a tie every day to work. In such places, the women will also wear a suit, often a more colorful one than the men. I have often been told that sporty Norwegian women in simple clothes, flat shoes, and barely wearing makeup are not attractive in this country. Many of them don't even color their hair. I also heard that Norwegian women dress this way because they are feminists. Yes, some of them are, but that does not necessarily influence the way they dress. And to us, consequently, Russian women look a bit too dressed up and wear far too much makeup and put on shoes which are certainly not meant for walking in rain, ice and snow. Maybe the Norwegian women disapprove more of this than the men. Some of the Norwegian answers to the Krylov questionnaire mentioned the formal dress code as one of the surprises they met here. Students dress casually in many places, and some students in Norway wear clothes that probably would not even be called casual, but rather ragged. By the way, clothes that look worn out can be latest fashion and expensive. Also, inhabitants of northern Norway are probably more casual than in most other places in that country. A Norwegian male student says in his questionnaire that he enjoyed the legs of Russian women in their high-heeled shoes, but at the same time felt very sorry for their feet and back. In Norway, we think that there is a rather high level of equality between women and men, and so do you in Russia. Gender equality, however, does not necessarily mean the same. We will mention the large proportion of women in government and leading positions in political parties, demands of both male and female members on the boards of companies, in many kinds of committees, etc. In Russia, we find that some professions which are almost male in Norway are considered women's work. I had written down engineering as one example, but when walking along the corridors here today, I came to think about painters, that kind of work too. The other way around, Russians are surprised to see young men working in Norwegian kindergartens. That is a rather new phenomenon, however, but it's one of the government's priorities now to get more young men to work in kindergartens and also in the lower classes at school. Norwegian women often dislike things that they consider somewhat degrading, that they feel they are considered inferior or only nice girls. So they might feel uneasy when Russian men will hold their coat, open doors, insist on paying at restaurants, theater, transport. On the other hand, the Norwegian women expect their husbands to take part in daily chores with children and home to a larger extent than Russian wives do here. And this goes especially for the well-educated women. And a tip to Norwegian men: don't be surprised when a Russian woman expects you to pay for her. And in general, there are many more countries than Russia where your colleagues or acquaintances will feel a bit uneasy when Norwegians split up a bill public and share the costs on everybody. Have you ever been in a situation where you talk to a person and the person moves some steps away from you and you wondered what's wrong? I have. Well, if that has happened to you, you have probably happened to get within the limits for what feels pleasant for that nation. Russians are supposed to have a circle of approximately 50 centimeters between them. Norwegians about a meter. I have never felt that Russians have stepped back when I've talked to them, but it has happened to me with Americans. Americans really need to have quite some distance to persons they are talking to. And Russians sit closer to each other. Women even closer than men when talking. Women friends will often walk arm in arm in the streets. Here one could of course be tempted to try and explain this by the fact that Norwegians have lived and still live further from each other than Russians do. Just think of the Russian villages with houses in a row in a center, and the Norwegian way of building their houses spread out in the terrain. Now, I'm not saying that it is because of this, but some people think so. When I grew up, people laughed at the pictures of Soviet politicians embracing and kissing the communist leaders of East European countries. Today, we embrace and kiss a lot more than we used to do in Norway. But I do think that the Norwegian Prime Minister would be embarrassed if a foreign politician, be it a man or a woman, he did not know quite well, tried to embrace him. The Russian tradition is for men to embrace each other. The Russian Orthodox Church did not allow the men to embrace and kiss women. This does of course not apply to family members. Russian men shake hands in a vigorous way and will often shake hands with the same person, if it's a man, several times if they meet anew the same day. Norwegians do not shake hands with their colleagues every morning at work. Further, there are different traditions in answering the common question of how are you? If I were not quite ill and really wanted to tell you, I would not consider such a question anything but conversation and answer a polite, takk bra, fine thanks. And one would be surprised if the answer was a not too well, or something indicating that the person is ill and thus invites you to a conversation about her health condition. In Russian, one would seldom say that everything is fine, but rather express that it's not too bad or so-so. Why so? Not to call on bad luck. This is something that some Norwegians would do too, touch wood, or as said in Norwegian, bank i bordet, touch the table, we say. The Russian old equivalent is tfu-tfu, niesklazitwy. In a direct translation, don't look at me with an evil eye. But the direct translation of knock on wood expression is spreading in Russian too. For a Russian watching Norwegians talk, they'll probably observe that we use our hands and arms and face mimics less than you do, and vice versa. I think that many gestures are of a kind that also a non-native would understand easily. But some are not easily understood. This one, I mean, is everybody will understand. But the Russians have, and probably still have, I don't know, a very special invitation with 2 fingers or 3 fingers. That is an invitation, a gesture for sharing the cost of a bottle of vodka on 2 or 3. Don't think it was used between the students, but you could easily see it when walking past the shops where they were selling liquor. I am not very familiar with swear words. And I think that both in Russia and Norway, men's vocabulary is richer than women's in this respect. I tried hard to persuade some of the male PhD students in my dormitory in Leningrad to teach me some pithy phrases, but they were most unwilling to do so. I think they were afraid that I should use them and tell where I had learned them. By the way, having translated some of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novels from life in the camps, it was certainly necessary to find out how to translate this layer of the vocabulary too. However, the Russian dictionaries in Soviet time listed only a few and the most decent swear words that even children and women could use. It is no doubt that swear words are more frequent in the Russian language than in Norwegian. But northern Norway is known to a flourishing amount of swear words and to use them frequently in speech and writing. Some words about names and personal pronouns. In Norwegian, the use of de, which I had hoped I could just write on a blackboard, but these words are very easy. I mean, de, it's your we. The use of these pronouns, the equivalent to we, has almost disappeared during the last 40 years in Norwegian, and faster and before in northern Norway than in Oslo. You will hardly hear a young person using de today, except in a few places where people are addressed only by surnames. The de could also be used to make fun of someone, and it sounds unfamiliar to most. It is, however, used in literature to depict times not far away. It seems to me that the use of the second personal singular of personal pronouns is spreading in other European languages too, for instance, in French and German. I'm not saying that those languages are on the verge of dropping their vous or sie. Neither is Russian, although Russian is also changing a bit in this respect. Use of names is also not easy. In Norway today, it's common to use only the given name, Imja. There are, however, persons who dislike being called by their given name and prefer that both given name and surname be used. Or if it is a woman, more often Mrs. and the surname. There are many names to choose between, and with the influx of immigrants, new names are spreading. And even if Norwegians are not ceremonious, I would, however, recommend the use of full names in official situations. Norwegians might smile and shake hands, even give you a hug, and seem familiar to you, but they are not necessarily so. Russian names are difficult for foreigners, difficult to remember and problematic to use. But it is certainly practical to have a given name, a patronymic, and a surname. And a challenge for outsiders to understand when it is necessary to use which ones. Now, a special problem is the use of diminutive forms of given names with many versions of the name, most of them representing different nuances of the relationship between the speaker and the bearer of the name. To us, it is also a bit strange that Sasha can be a girl or a boy, as can, for instance, Valja. On the other hand, looking at given names, it's usually easy to see if we are talking about a boy or a girl. And the patronymic always, and the surnames most often, will show the gender of the person. This is not so with Norwegian names. So Russian names are more practical in some ways. It is important to use the right names, at least in official situations. I do, however, think that it should be the responsibility of the interpreter to assure the correct use of names and pronouns, although not everyone agrees to that. And I think it is important that the students learn about this in language classes. One can certainly get along with the wrong use of names, but everybody likes to be addressed in a polite way. And the teacher will want the students to use both their given name and their patronymic. Also, a teacher, and even a young one, should insist that their foreign students address her or him in a correct way. If not, how can they learn? Russians also use polite expressions in a way that we not always do. And when I've asked Norwegian students what surprised them during their first visit to Russia, quite a few of them have answered that they had not expected that live Russians would use all those polite phrases that the Norwegian teachers had tried to put into their heads. All the "can you please tell us," "excuse me please," "excuse me, do you know where I can find?" It is also the interpreter's responsibility that this is taken care of course, and both ways. And also, it is the Russian tradition to use the name of the interlocutor more often than is done in Norwegian. One thing that is often said to be a characteristic of Russians is that they don't smile in public. This is something, not when you sit in the first row, this is something one often hears from foreigners who come back from Russia, and it primarily refers to the crowds in the streets, but also, for instance, about sales assistants in the shops, who, when asked why they don't smile to their customers, answering, if they need something, they'll buy it whether I smile or not. This I've taken from a Russian book, it's not something I'm thinking of. And there is a Russian proverb, "Смех без причины, признак дурачины." If you laughter without reason is a symptom of stupidity. Going around just smiling, it's just not part of the Russian custom. It's a good thing to look serious and somewhat worried. This can be said to be a way of the Russians' cautious and pessimistic view of life. I once received a New Year's letter from a Russian acquaintance who stated that the new year would certainly be better than the old one, considering that the old one was a leap year, so the new year thus would be one day shorter. In his book, Professor Krylov lists as an example of what Russians should be aware of with Norwegians. The Norwegians come to meetings or negotiations smiling as if you were old friends. It is not clear who is the boss in the group and who the one who will make the decisions is. They might even embrace you, and that goes for both women and men. And yes, the Norwegian will often not realize that there is a difference between a dinner party in the evening and negotiations next morning that demand a more serious attitude, even if the night before had been informal. Friendship is a serious thing. In Vladimir Dahl's Russian dictionary from the 19th century, there is almost 100 sayings about friends and friendship. Some of them we use in Norwegian too. However, I think that the Russian word družba is more serious than the Norwegian vennskap. Maybe it is better to be someone's drug than his venn. I have been told by several persons, Russians, that the two words družba and vennskap obviously do not mean the same. Norway is a small country, my interlocutor continued, but all Norwegians can still not be friends. The reason for saying this was that whenever he asked Norwegians if they knew who a person was, they would always answer, "Oh yes, she's a friend of mine." In Russia, my interlocutor continued, a drug is usually someone you've known from childhood or at least from school or university. Someone you're willing to do anything for. And this is reciprocal. You expect them to do anything for you too. Sometimes more than a Norwegian is prepared to do. Friendship in Russia is said to compensate for social security and things like banks, different kinds of counseling, car rental, etc. This is actually so also with hospitality. Often Russian hospitality is overwhelming for Norwegians, with long dinners and lots of food, with being accompanied everywhere while we leave much to our guests' initiatives and leave them on their own when they probably would have preferred to be taken more care of. I admit that it is with some reluctance I say this. I do hope that our wonderful Russian hosts will continue to take such good care of us as they have done till now, and also that we can be better hosts when you are in Norway. A Russian evening meal is a tasty adventure, starting with a whole range of delicate first courses, salads, fish, meat, mushrooms, egg dishes, and always white and black bread. When everybody has tasted everything, there will be a little break before the main course is served. Russians usually don't mix kinds of drinks the way we do. We use different beverages with the different courses, as white or red wine with fish, red wine with meat, cognac with the coffee. In Russia, most often the men will drink vodka while the women drink wine, or champagne if it's a special celebration, through the meal. Nowadays there will always be mineral water and juice as well. And Russians never drink without a zakuska, something to eat. After the main course has been eaten, there will be a short break before the dessert is served. Tea and coffee will be served in the end, but if there is more food left, it might very well be brought back and served again. And you will be seated around the table the whole evening. This is very different from Norway, where one will sit at the table and eat, but usually not remain seated at the table after the meal. Coffee and tea will often be served with the dessert, or drunk in another room with cake and cognac and things the like. The Russian hostess' duty is to make the guests eat, and she will offer more as long as there is something left. In the old days, you were supposed to say no at least the first time you were asked. But the hostess will not accept a no and try hard to make you eat more. The Norwegians always say "takk for maten," thank you for the food. And even at official parties, someone will always be asked to do so. In Russia, there is no "takk for maten" speech at official dinners. One will praise the nice evening, fruitful visit, hope for further cooperation, and the like. In a home, one must absolutely praise the hostess and the excellent food and make a toast. And it's never sufficient to say just the word skål, or skål for a name or an occasion. A Russian toast is much more than a toast. The more important the occasion, the stricter are the rules. The host or the hostess will say the first toast to welcome the guests. The second toast should be pronounced shortly after the first and can be for the host and the hostess, and praise the hostess for her ability to make a nice party with a beautiful table and excellent food. Or the host could say a toast for all his friends. However, one should always make a short speech, tell a short story, something funny or relevant for the situation when one is asked. to stand up and make a toast. A Norwegian family invited a Russian student to stay with them while she was studying at a summer course in Tromse. Svetlana was a nice and well-behaved young woman. However, she made her Norwegian family nervous. She hardly ate anything. So they called me and asked me to find out what the girl liked to eat. It turned out that the girl liked the food. She missed bread, of course. But the problem was that she was not used to eating so quickly. Her new family finished their food in a hurry, got up, carried away the food and plates, and moved into another room. Svetlana was used to sitting around the dinner table for a long time, talking about the events of the day and plans for tomorrow, etc. And the same goes for invited dinners in somebody's home. Russians will miss the warm, nice atmosphere in a Russian kitchen where everybody hangs around for hours and more food is served all the time. In Norway, you are likely to be served an aperitif when you arrive at a party, a drink with no food accompanying it. In general, Norwegians can sit, chat and drink both beer, wine and spirits without eating. I suppose the Russian way of always swallowing some food, salted cucumbers, bit of sausage, dried fish when drinking is much better for one's health. Beer is popular in both Norway and Russia. In Russia it's drunk at pubs and in the streets, as far as I observe, and for leisure, usually not at parties. Some words about the questionnaires that Alexander Krylov and I are collecting. When we interviewed students 10 years ago and asked what they knew about the country they were studying, both Russians and Norwegians had some basic knowledge and liked the other country. The Russian students said that Norway is a beautiful country, rich, sports are important. A typical Norwegian is practical, economic, sporty, and individualist who is proud of her birthplace, be it a cultural center or a tiny village. They could not mention any Norwegian politician, no other authors than Henrik Ibsen. They all knew Edvard Grieg. One mentioned Edvard Munch, and all of them mentioned Roald Amundsen and Thor Heyerdahl when asked about travelers. And one girl mentioned the name of one Norwegian skier. The Norwegian students also liked Russia, an enormous country, rich in natural resources. They found that the Russians are proud that they live in such a large country, and according to them, Russians are hospitable, patient, and modest. When asked about politicians and businessmen, they all mentioned Gorbachev, Putin, and Abramovich. They knew Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, mentioned Tchaikovsky, but they did not know any artists, travelers, or athletes. Well, I have to admit that I was a bit disappointed that students who must be assumed to be interested in Russia and Norway did not know more about their study subject. But then, of course, this was just in the beginning of the cooperation with the Barents region. And most people had probably not imagined that the world would change as rapidly as it did and open up for such possibilities not only for traveling, but also for collaboration. I mentioned already that the Russian students were skeptical to the news that at their college it would soon become possible to take part in student exchange. Tromse is a small city, but it's quite international, and it has always been the part of the university's strategy that a specific percentage of students should be foreigners. In 2011, 10% of the students were foreigners, Russians constituting the largest group, and the objectives for the 5-year plan is that it should amount to 15%. And also a certain proportion of the University of Tromse students should spend at least a semester at another university, but they don't at this time. It is actually also the part of the government's strategy for internationalization of higher education. The last white paper was presented to the Norwegian Parliament in 2009, and the Ministry of Education and Research states that the universities shall have a comprehensive education cooperation of high quality, contributing to increased education quality. So that's why we want to have international university. We think it will contribute to increased education quality, like you're having this seminar with us today, and tomorrow and day after tomorrow. When the first Russian exchange students arrived in Tromse in 1993, one could easily see them, because they always kept together in a group, as if they felt different and needed to keep track of one another. They were reluctant to take part in students' after-class activities. They needed their stipend money to bring necessary things back home. But this did fortunately not last long. It's not like that anymore. Let me share with you some of the findings from this year's questionnaire. We have not repeated the same questions as many years ago. We know much more about each other and each other's countries. Most of the students and researchers have visited the other countries several times and been to different places. Some of the Norwegians said that their stereotype of Russia and Russians was that all Russians were clustered in big identical apartment houses. They were surprised. They were surprised by the amount of guards everywhere. The word guard here comprising different duties, from watching who comes and leaves in dormitories, in small shops, in the streets, in every room in all museums, etc. It has also been mentioned with example from Petersburg, not from Arkhangelsk, that they were stopped and asked to show identity cards several times. I must say that this has never happened to me, not in Russia and not in Norway. But people are asked about identity papers in the streets in Norway too, especially if you don't look like a white Norwegian. Most of the respondents say that they have friends and acquaintances in the other country whom they would like to visit or be happy to welcome in their own country. The students who have only been to summer school did not have an opportunity to get to know persons of their same age. However, one of them wrote that he would like to go back and visit his landlady. And we asked, what do you like best with people from the other country? Norwegians said about Russians. Russians are hospitable and friendly, have a strong sense of humor when you get to know them. Russians are good at not defining difficulties as problems, but overcoming them with simple tools and little money. They are very creative. Russian food is excellent, especially the soups. Russians are well educated, but a bit conservative in their view of arts. Russians said about Norwegians. Norwegians are open, friendly, helpful. They show high competence and discipline in their work, love nature and sports. They worship their family and home. They are northerners. That is, they are friendly, frank, they don't talk much, are calm, patient, and reliable. So we asked, what would you recommend that we learn from the other country? Russians are interested in and very good at preserving cultural monuments. This has been said by several students. Norwegians should stop seeing problems everywhere and rather look for solutions without having to spend a lot of money just because we have the money. We should strive for more recycling. Russian food is delicious. The enormous human warmth in the cold Russian north should be transferred to Norway. It would be good if culture could have the same important place in teaching and in civil society in Norway as in Russia. The Norwegians care for the environment and understanding of the necessity of handing over clean water and air to our descendants should be introduced in Russia too. Russians should take into account the considerable beforehand preparation and discussions, agreements, distribution of rights and obligations that need to be carried out before a project work starts. Actually, from the Norwegian side, some persons with experience from cooperation that had failed also mentioned that the preparations were not adequate. The role of trade unions in working life, the role of non-governmental organizations in community life, and the students' possibility of taking part in decision-making bodies at their schools are other things that Russians would like to copy. There are many things in Norway that Russia should copy, writes another. However, that is unfortunately not realistic. Things are slowly changing as more Russians spend more time abroad. In addition to technology and knowledge, Russia should also introduce Norway's high level of democracy in all spheres, including attitudes to people with restricted possibilities, to children and old people. It would be nice to see the same approach to work, the same level of service. So far, the answers from the Norwegian side are mostly from students or former students, while the Russian answers partly come from people who have had working relations with Norway, but the plans are to broaden our pool of answers. While Russians respect leaders, or at least many of them call for order, they don't keep strictly to rules and laws, but rather think a lot about how to get around the rules. In Norway, most people respect laws and regulations. There are, however, some that quite a few of us think it's more or less okay to break. And here I can mention bringing more than the permitted quota of wine and spirits into the country. This reminds me of a true example of not understanding one another. An acquaintance of mine went to Russia to buy an aluminum factory and started out by explaining that strict ethical rules were imperative to his company. There would be no transaction if bribes were expected or offered. His Russian counterpart showed his guest his driver's license and pointed to a small stamp in the corner. You see the small stamp here? Do you know what it means? No? Well, if I'm stopped by the police for speeding and show my license, I will not be fined. Would you call that corruption? Yes, I would. So what would happen to you if you were stopped for speeding? I would have to pay a fine and could also lose my license. Well, I pay on beforehand, you pay afterwards. What's the difference? Almost everybody in our material say that they have friends they would like to visit and have visiting. And many do visit each other. And guess what has been mentioned among the things that would be good to bring back to Norway? Babushkin, grandmothers to cook Russian food. As for the Russian food, especially soups and black bread are praised, and also vodka, I must say. The Russians do not praise Norwegian food at all, other than commenting on the strange habit of Norwegians eating sandwiches at all times. Norwegians need to take better care of cultural monuments and should learn from Russia how to improve our work in this field. And we should stop seeing problems everywhere and rather look for easier way out of so-called problems, I think this is quite an interesting observation, actually. It comes from both sides and says something. There are some remarks from both countries about different approaches to work and about project plannings. I have talked about the way we dress earlier, and we have a comment from a Russian man that he likes the simple way of dressing in Norway, and also how women and men dress in the same way with the same kind of clothes. In the airport yesterday in Oslo, going to Moscow, I met a Norwegian journalist and his small bilingual and bicultural daughter, Alexandra. His wife and Sasha's mother was among the first students of the Norwegian at Komor State Teachers College. And when I met him, he asked where I was going, and I said I was going to Arkhangelsk. And he said, well, the collaboration between our university has certainly played a very important role in building trust among us and knowledge about each other. At the Tromse Museum, there is for the time being an exhibition called Cold Coasts Close Relationships, Холодные теплые отношения, about Russian and Norwegian polar seafaring expeditions. I think it will come here later. The exhibition is the result of a collaborative project between the museums in Tromse, Arkhangelsk and Onega. The ambition of the project is to find out more about what our predecessors learned from each other. Our coasts will hopefully remain cold and not get too warm, while the relationships develop further and we learn more from each other. Thank you for listening.